Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to the CRAM podcast. CRAM is an acronym for Communicating Research and More, which is what we try to do on this podcast. A lot of exciting research and groundbreaking ideas never reach the public, but they have the potential to change the way we think and act. Well, spring has sprung, and that means we're starting to see nature come alive after the long sleep of winter. Plants will flower, birds and bees will be back on our doorstep, and so will ants. They're creatures we usually overlook, unless they become unwanted guests, but we ignore them at our peril. Ants have been around for about 200 million years, and there's a good chance they'll outlast us. They're one of the most successful creatures on the planet, and as Aaron Fairweather believes, we have much to learn from them. Aaron is an entomologist and Ph.D. candidate in the Department of Environmental Sciences at the University of Guelph and an ant lover. Hello, Aaron.
Hello.
I have to tell you, I just reread the short story Trailhead by biologist E.O. Wilson for, I'm sure it's at least the fifth time. And for those people who don't know about it, it's about the life and death of an ant colony. And, Aaron, I know you're familiar with the work as well. It never fails to inspire me with awe every time I read it. And I read it because I wanted to prime myself for this interview, and I got so excited reading it. I mean, what does that article and, well, the work of E.O. Wilson, what does it inform you about ants?
So much because EO really contributed a huge amount to the field. He really brought to us the understanding that ants are able to communicate with one another in really complicated ways, and that they are really a super organism in a way at the colony level. They function very much for the survival of all of their sisters and the queen. And I think that is pretty incredible that they're so successful because of this cooperation and communication.
Yeah, I mean, ever since I read that, honestly, that was changing a game changer for me in the way I looked at ants. What what was it for you that inspired you to pursue this kind of research?
So I've just always loved insects in general. I was the little kid on the playground with my head in the dirt, looking at the anthills and seeing what they were doing and what they were up to. I have journals from when I was as young as 2 years old of me drawing caterpillars and watching them grow and little ant terrariums and that kind of thing. And I just kind of pursued that throughout my entire life. And I got lucky in high school where I started working at a local museum, and there was a really great opportunity because we didn't have any information on ants in the eastern part of Canada. And so I got to go on a course talking about ant diversity, taxonomy, and ecology. And that's where my spark kind of started with them specifically, is learning that there was so much that we needed to learn and know, and that they were so fascinating and so strangely like us, but so different at the same time.
Well, I want to talk about ants right now. I mentioned it is spring. Tell us what ants are doing right now.
So there are a few species that are just starting to wake up. There's kind of like a timeline of different species waking up and starting to get active in the environment. There's things like the winter ant, Prenolepis imparus, which is a very common species around Canada, North America in general. And they really start to become active this time of the year. They don't like interacting with other ants very much. And so they are foraging for food, they're scavenging things, and then they'll go quiet again in a couple of months as they've scavenged enough food to survive throughout the summer, and they'll come back up in the fall. And then you get other species like Tetromorium immigrans, the common sidewalk ant, that will start to wake up and see that there are other ants around them and not like that very much.
When we were having a chat, you pointed out something really interesting that happens in the spring. And you were saying that a lot of people would just ignore it. And it's when these ants are getting into, I guess, battle on the sidewalk or on the road, and we'll just totally ignore it and step over it, not realizing that there's a war going on at our feet. Can you tell us
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah, so that's what I was mentioning with Tetromorium immigrants, not liking that there are other ants near them. So there are so many colonies of this particular species along the sidewalk that they're crammed in space with one another. And then when the spring starts and the soil starts to move around and thaw, sometimes boundaries between colonies break apart and they start to interact with one another. And then they get very territorial. They don't like their space being invaded. And so they flood out onto the sidewalk and they'll start to actually war with one another in the open. They'll start to rip each other's heads off. And it's a very gruesome affair. But because they're so tiny and there's so many of them, they often just look like the soil. Like there's this raw earth that's been exposed and you step over it on the sidewalk because you don't really notice it. But if you bend down and look, it's literally hundreds of thousands of ants that are swarming over one another. Ants in general, they don't really compete with the environment or other species very much, other taxonomic groups. They more are competitive with one another. They are really so successful that their main enemies are each other in terms of occupying space and resources now.
Really? So what, like natural predators? Who would they be?
They do have natural predators, like things like birds will feed on them and that kind of thing. But because of the colony structure, the queen is the reproductive unit. So it is what is required for the survival and the safety of these entire ant colonies. And they're usually pretty well protected, right? They're underneath the ground. They're isolated in chambers. They have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of ants protecting them from potential danger. So typically, like as a unit of individual, you could call it, these ants are pretty safe. And so they don't really need to worry about other species destroying them very much. Whereas other ants, they are very efficient at maybe raiding colonies. They will sometimes like invade other colonies and kill the queen specifically because they know that will end up killing the entire colony of ants.
And why would they do that? Why would they go and what's the reason why they would go and raid another colony?
A number of reasons. So one of them is, again, resources. So if it's space, maybe they want to occupy that nest. Maybe it's a species that doesn't want to build their own nest, but they want some space for themselves. So they kill an ant colony that has made a nest already. Another is food. So if there's limited food resources around, maybe one colony will want to kill another one off. So all of the food in that area is for just them. Another reason could be just that the ants are food themselves. Killing off the queen and then raiding all of the babies of that colony is food for that new colony. So there's a bunch of different reasons.
They will be cannibalistic when they need to.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I mean, ants are so abundant that it's a good food resource, right? There's so many of them in the environment that there's just a lot of food to go around.
And they'll even eat their dead, won't they?
Yeah. So they will utilize, if a worker doesn't seem like it's been infected with anything particularly bad, they'll collect those workers back and rip them apart, take the meat that's left in them, and then the shell, the exoskeleton that's left gets put into a graveyard.
So I have to tell you one thing that, well, not just one, but something that struck me from that article I read, Trailhead, I just found it so interesting, was it's about these two colonies, right, that go at it. And it seemed to be so tactical, like strategic, because I mean, not knowing, you just think, okay, one group is just going to go to war with the other. But no, there was this initial thing where they kind of were checking each other out and doing these kind of movements or dance or whatever. Like, what's going on before they actually, go to war, go to battle?
So there's a whole slew of behaviors that these ants do that we aren't really sure what's going on there, right? One of the things when two colonies interact is sometimes they will just talk to each other. They'll tap antenna against each other, or they will spray some pheromones and let each other know that there is some kind of disturbance going on, or there is going to be some conflict that's happening. We're not sure exactly why they do it in some of these cases. They're also just seeing how the defenses of the other colony is, right? Like, if you don't want to go into war with somebody if they're going to just destroy you. So feeling out like how strong are these other ants in this kind of environment and that kind of thing.
Oh. And do they also have these kind of body movements? Because again, this is a fiction story, but I'm assuming he's a biologist, so it's based on truth. But they tried to make themselves seem bigger. They filled themselves with some fluid, so their abdomens expanded, and they kind of stood up more. I mean, I mean, other animals do that as well. So ants are no different?
Yeah, ants are no different in that regard. They will definitely put on aggressive displays to say, "Hey, I'm threatening, and I could potentially kill you. Like, leave me alone." They do all kinds of things, like also just release different smells into the environment. These pheromones, but also like acids and stuff like that, that will tell the other ants, like, "I am dangerous. Like, I have these defensive chemicals. Leave me alone." So all kinds of different behaviors and
Wow.
physiological
So
traits.
these acids, are they like, so they're poison to the other ants?
Yeah, yeah. So there's a variety of different chemical compounds that ants use. The most common ones being formic acid and citric acid. And if you have a concentrated formic acid, it's like the smell. If you've ever picked up an ant or squished it on you, there's like acrid smell that they can sometimes leave. That's the formic acid. And if you spray enough of that in a small ant's face, it's probably going to die.
Oh, and what about the pheromones? Because I understand there are different ones and they mean different things, right? That they
Yeah.
secrete.
Yeah. So the ants have kind of developed this entire hugely complicated language around these chemical cues. So there's organs on their feet for telling, okay, this is a trail that is going to lead to food. Here, I'm going to lay out a chemical trail along with that. There are pheromones in their gasters or their butts whenever they're going to spray acid, or if they have a stinger that they can leave with a stinger that tells this is an enemy. Whatever I've attacked is an enemy. You have pheromones that exist in the face and the mandibles and in the antenna that can tell, okay, I am communicating, I'm saying hello, like that's it. Or I'm telling you that I am the same member of your species based on the chemical that I'm using. So very complicated and hugely
Um,
diverse across their entire bodies.
yeah. Can you just kind of create a scenario or walk us through something where, like, let's say there is an attack
Yeah.
going on from one colony and they're going to go into another? And then what would the reaction be of the other colony? Like, can you just walk us through? Because I want to see how all this plays out.
So the defending colony would have a variety of scouts and soldiers in the environment around the nest that is kind of like the first line of defense. They're going to say, "Oh, I've seen the threat." And they will go back to the colony and start to release a bunch of pheromones, tap antenna with other ants and say, "Something's coming. We have to be ready." Then that will activate the soldiers in the colony. So these are bigger individuals. They are genetically the same as all their sisters, but they are typically like a bigger individual ant, and they will come out onto the surface and they will be ready for a battle. They have bigger mandibles, bigger heads, bigger bodies. And they kind of form like a defensive perimeter around the nest. They will do those behaviors you mentioned, like they will stand up, they will bulk up their abdomens, they will like open their mandibles, they will start to release different pheromones. There will be a pile of ants that starts to block the entrances to their colonies. So they actually physically try and stop anything from getting inside, defending it like in a very physical way. And depending on the species you have different kinds of ants that are really specialized for that. There is a group called the turtle ants that have a flat head, and they will literally just stick their heads into the hole where their nest is and create a door so nothing can get into the colony. There are
Oh my
physiological
goodness.
specializations in that way. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah. So, okay, so those are the ants that are on the defense. They're readying themselves. And then what about the aggressors? What are they doing?
So they'll be kind of trying to form a perimeter around the nest. They'll be trying to see what the defenses are like how many of the enemy are there that they have to contend with, and judging, can we deal with this colony? Are we going to lose if we try and raid them, or are like we going to win? And so they're actually playing out this like strategy war game of like what's our resources compared to theirs. And then if they've deemed that they are strong enough, then they'll start to aggress. They will try and pick off individual ants from the colony and like pull them away, specifically target like smaller groups that are maybe isolated. They'll start to aggress towards the defending ants, and they'll try and force them to come away from the nest, and they'll slowly pick them off that way. In some cases, if it's a really heat of the moment aggressive behavior, like these Tetramorium immigrants, sometimes they'll just instantly clash. They'll come at one another at full force and just start ripping apart each other until there is nobody left. And one colony is clearly the winner.
Wow. So is the whole intent they're trying to get inside the nest? Are they
Yeah.
That's what they're trying to do, right? And they're trying
Yeah.
to go for the queen?
Yep. Typically, it's go for the queen, either get rid of her if you can, or if you can't get rid of the queen and the queen somehow managed to escape, like a side passage that they had ready for her or something, take as many brood as you can. So the soft baby larval ants, that they are really nutrient rich. So they're a good resource to take and try and feed your own colony, replenish your own numbers afterwards. So that's kind of one
Ah.
of the spoils of war.
What happens if they get to that queen and they do kill her? What happens to, let's say there are still a lot of the other ants, the workers, the fighters, they're still left, but the queen is now dead.
It depends on the species. So if you've had a raid from just two colonies that are warring with one another, there's nothing really relationship wise between them. They'll just kill off all the other workers and they'll either take the space or they'll just take the larva and go back to their own colony. But there are special species of ants that are called slave makers. And these species will take the larvae and they will take the remaining workers and force them back to their own colony and start to make them do their menial labor. So they will forage for food. They will take care of their own larvae. They will build the colony up. It's pretty gruesome behavior.
They'll make them do the menial labor. So they're sitting around like on sofas, like enjoying the good life.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And typically these slave making ants, this parasite species, there are bigger species. They have like big heads and big mandibles, and there's not many of them in the colony. So there's not as many of them typically. They just rely on the numbers from that host colony that they've enslaved to like bolster themselves rather than doing anything themselves. And the crazy part is in some species, if the slave maker, that like parasite species, doesn't have a host, then they will just die out. They don't know how to do their own work and they will just fade away.
Oh. So the thing though, I'm wondering is how do you get those ants to come along with you? I mean, is it by pure force that they drag them out? Or, I mean, how does that happen?
So there's kind of two means. One is by pure force. You like kind of um, you make them docile. You make them like kind of like, okay, there's nothing else I can do, so they'll just be drugged back to the colony and they're exhausted. Another is by mimicking the pheromones of that enslaved colony. So that host species has a specific cue that says, I am your species. And they'll start releasing that compound and trying to placate the host species and tell them, like, okay, we're the same. So come back with me because you don't have a queen anymore.
They
And
can
that often
disguise
works.
themselves?
Yeah,
That's kind of
exactly.
it. How do they know how to do that? Like, how
So
does that happen?
millions of years of evolution. Like I say, these ants have had so long to compete with one another for resources in the environment, and that is their main like competition. So over millions of years, they've figured out that okay, these are the strategies that we can use to be most successful in the environment, and one of them is by taking over these other colonies and not having to deal with it ourselves, put our own energy into it, rather take the energy from somebody else. And often these species are also highly related. So they evolutionarily diverged at a point, and one of them became a slave maker and the other one became the host. That's just how it worked.
I mean, we can't do that.
No,
We
not
haven't,
not in our
we,
time scales.
yeah, right. We have not evolved to, I mean, that just shows you how far along they've come
Yeah.
compared to us, that they can even disguise themselves. And I mean, when the queen dies, does something happen to her subjects? Do they just kind of lose hope? Or, I mean, what happens to, because they're genetically programmed, right, to follow her.
Not necessarily. They're
No? Oh,
programmed to follow the cues of the colony. So it's like your
ah.
cells in your body. The cells will respond to various hormones and other chemicals in your body to tell them, okay, this is what we're doing now. We're lifting something for muscle cells. We're paying attention and we're interpreting information from the environment. Those differentiations are based on like those chemical cues and stuff. Ants function in a very similar way. So based on the chemical cues from their sisters and the queen, they will respond to different things in the environment. But if the queen dies, then they can still very much function together, each other. They just won't have that additional resource of new workers to supplement them at the end of their life. That's just kind of it.
And she is the baby maker. right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So, how many babies are we talking about for a queen?
Oh. It depends on the species, but things like leafcutter ants, they can
Okay.
lay. I think it's about 100 million workers in their lifetimes. This is a typical range. At any given moment, there can be up to like 2 million workers in a single leafcutter ant colony. So it's a lot. Like they
That
reproduce a lot.
and those are all hers?
Yep, those are all hers.
And that's only one.
Yeah, yep. One and from
That's
one mating
scary.
event. Yeah,
One from one mating event.
yeah.
Okay, and so how long roughly can they live? Queen ants?
Some species are shorter lived. They only live like 1 to 5 years, but we know that there are some very long lived ants. Some very common species that we have in Canada, Lasius neoniger, which I work on, it can live up to 20 to 30 years. The longest lived queen was about 67 years old, 62, 67. So they can
Gosh,
live a long time.
that sounds like a human queen, like
Yeah,
60s. Yeah.
yeah.
Um, so okay, and then going back to the mating, how does that happen?
So typically once a year, these ants have what's called a nuptial flight. This is a period at which new queens or queens to be princesses are born in the colony and males. And these are winged individuals. So they are able to disperse and mate with other colonies in the environment.
Okay.
And
And
then
that's
on a,
set at birth, right? Sorry.
yeah,
That's set, yeah, that's set at birth. Okay.
exactly. Yeah. So when ants are being born, they can be activated in specific ways that tells them that this is the role that you're going to have and this is what you will look like physiologically. And
Hmm.
so this is one of those things. The queens to be and the males will fly out on a very specific day. All colonies from the area, like of this one species, all fly up at the same time and they will start to mate in the air with one another. And then the queen will rip off her wings after she's been mated and find a place to nest.
Okay. So first of all, you said all colonies in the area.
Yeah.
How do they know they are all supposed to fly up there on that one day?
And so it's a really interesting like combination of environmental cues that we're still trying to discover. One of them we know is typically there are climatic events or like weather events that happen at very specific times or within like a week or two of each other every year, and they can tell that okay, there's going to be this big rainstorm, and after it, we're going to all fly up based on the humidity, the pressure in the atmosphere, all of these things. Another is temperature and day length. So depending on like how hot it is out and what the photo period of the day is, they can determine, okay, it's about this time of year. We're all going to fly up at this time. And the other thing that we are just starting to learn is that UV, the amount of UV in the atmosphere is very critical for them deciding when to fly up. So depending on the intensity of that UV light, they will say, okay, today's the day that we're going to fly out. And based on that big complicated set of events, then they all know, okay, this day at this time, we're all going to fly all together.
Wow. So that just is another reason why the environment and cues and taking care of the environment is so important, right? Because if we
Yeah.
throw anything off, well, with climate change, with the ozone layer, with anything, then it throws not just well, it throws everything off, but ants too.
Oh, yeah. And
Yeah.
we're already seeing that kind of thing. So, with a lot of common species in Ontario, Canada, where I work, we're seeing shifts in the periods at which they are doing their nuptial flights. Lasius neoniger is somewhat variable, but it used to be very concrete that they were flying around Labor Day. They're also called the Labor Day ant um, every year. But now, some years it's pushed all the way into like middle or end of September. And a
Oh.
lot of that is due to that climatic change.
Oh. So, okay. So you're saying then that most likely the cues are all environmental. It's nothing to do with them communicating with each other.
No,
No.
not
That
definitely
okay.
not colonies communicating across space.
Okay.
It's entirely
Yeah.
just judging based on those cues.
And you said it would be colonies all of the same species,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Who in other circumstances, they could be warring against each other,
Yeah. That's exactly
which
right.
I find is interesting. So you So when it comes to sex, it's like, okay, truce. It's
Yeah.
it's peace. It's peacetime for today. Is that
Yeah,
right? Is that what
especially with
happens?
those Tetramorium immigrants ants, like they will be maybe warring with one colony, and maybe if they didn't kill each other off, they could be still staying pretty close to one another. And that same year, later on in the year, be like, okay, we're doing a nuptial flight now, and all of them fly up, and like nobody's conflicting with one another. They're just like, okay, we're all going to mate and go off.
See, what does that say about ants, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
it just, right. No,
they
I
are
mean, it just, that
implicit.
instinct.
Yeah, implicitly in their genetic code, they understand that like there is a greater goal of propagating ourselves into the next generation, and no matter the small current issues like space and food and that kind of thing, we all need
Yep.
to still do this mating event because that means that we evolve and grow over time.
Wow. So then once those princesses
Yeah,
mate with the winged males, right?
yeah.
Uh do those princesses then become queens or what happens to them?
Yeah, typically they'll land, they'll find a place to nest, and they'll rip off their wings, and they'll decide this is where we're hunkering down and going to start a nest. Now, there's so many of them, and it's so difficult to find like a really safe place to nest that a lot of those queens get picked off by predators like birds and small mammals and that kind of thing. And
Okay.
a lot of them just die to environmental factors, like if there's flooding or a heavy rain, or like they
Mhm.
can't find a place to for cover, that kind of thing. A lot of them will die during those events, but there's so many of them that are like in the air and mating and trying to find new places to nest that they still are highly, highly successful.
And then what happens to those winged males?
They die instantly. So they
Oh
mate,
my
and then
goodness.
that's the end of their life.
Because that's kind of what all they were good for? Is that what we're
Yeah.
supposed to assume?
Yeah, well, and it's kind of incredible with ants. They have this really unique sexual system. So we are all diploid organisms, like humans. That means that we have two sets of our parents' genes. In the case of ants, the females of a colony are diploid, so they have both sets, but males are only haploid. They only have one set of those genes. And a lot of those genes are very evolutionarily repressed or older kind of character traits. The male ants, they look very much like a wasp almost. They don't even look like the same species. It's
Oh.
really interesting, like looking at the history of ant species and discovering ants, because male ants were put into a different family of organisms entirely because we didn't know that they were the same species. We didn't even know if they were ants
Mm.
because they looked so physically different. And so the females really are the whole creators of the colony. They are the whole like functional unit. They are doing all of the
Right.
work. They are reproducing. Whereas the males, they are produced at that one nuptial flight event, usually like a month before it, and then they exist in the colony. They don't do anything, and then they fly up, they mate, and as soon as they're done mating, they die.
Wow. See, again, I mean, because it's the females that really are responsible for the survival. I mean, yes, the
Yeah.
males obviously have a role too, but um, they're important. And just
Yeah.
like the queen, right? Like she's numero uno. We got to take care of her. We got to feed her. We got to make sure she's good. Like that whole emphasis placed on the importance of the females and the queens.
Yeah.
That's it. That's evolved thinking.
Yeah, I agree.
Wow. So, I mean, with just the stats around this, the princesses, you're talking about the millions and millions of eggs for each queen.
Yeah.
Uh, I mean, ants, as I said, have been around for about 200 million years, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And I can only imagine that the populations, I don't know if it's been, I'm assuming it's been exponential growth. Has it been?
I would say so. I mean, if we're looking at the entire evolutionary history of ants, for the first maybe 150 million years that they were on the planet, it was a pretty steady growth. And then as soon as angiosperms or flowering plants became like started to grow and propagate, that's when ants, just like pollinators, started to really explode in numbers and species and diversify. They really started this really niche, tight knit relationship with plants, especially. And so that's really like the explosion. And now, especially after that, we see like an exponential growth in the abundance and the diversity of ants on the planet.
What about ants in relation to humans? I mean, we're way out of whack, that statistic. It's
Yeah.
gotta
So
be.
for every 1 pound of human, there is about 4 pounds of ants on the planet. That's what we estimate. So there is over 4 times the amount of biomass of ants than there are humans, like on planet Earth.
And so roughly, how many ants could be in 4 pounds?
Oh,
Roughly.
that would, it depends on the ant,
Yeah,
but
okay, but
probably like 100,000 or so, I would say. So there's a lot.
100,000.
Yeah.
Wow, that is, and the other thing too that has intrigued me is, and you mentioned this earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so often we see ants as being pests. We don't really notice them, but oh, they get in the house and now they're annoying us. They're after our food. But you said that they've adapted to their environment to the extent that they can even make the environment work for them, like they're
Yeah.
farmers, right? In agriculture. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So there are a number of different ways that ants have started to utilize other species around them. Plants are a great example because they provide food for the ants. There's like the nectar of flowers, there's pollen, there's like the fruits and that kind of thing. And ants have evolved in so many different ways to utilize that. Some ants are active gardeners. So there's one species in Ontario called Aphinogaster picea, and they actively find seeds in the environment, will take them into their colonies, plant them, and then grow up the trees like over time. They will help raise them. And then the plants and trees will start to produce fruit and seeds, and the ants will use those as food resources. So they understand that like we're going to get a resource from this plant. They
That is
actively do
so
agriculture.
brilliant. Like,
Yeah.
you just wonder how that came about over, I
Yeah.
guess, again, millions of years or whatever.
Yeah.
And what about there was an interesting example that I came across about aphids.
Yeah. So there's a lot of insects in that group that aphids are in, Hemiptera, that they feed on the xylem and phloem of plants. They have like a needle-like mouth part, and they stick it into the plant, and they drink the plant's juices. And doing that, they produce something called honeydew, which is a very sugar-rich liquid. And ants have learned that, oh, this is a really great food resource for us, and it's filtered through the aphid. So we're going to start to raise them like cattle. They will actually harvest them and move them around the plants, and grow them up and feed on that honeydew over time. It's the exact same way that we deal with cows. We get the milk from them, but sometimes we also eat them for protein. And the ants will do the same thing with aphids.
Would it be a certain kind of species of ants that does that?
A lot of species do that.
Oh, a
So
lot of them.
there's,
Okay.
yeah, I would say, especially in Ontario, about like 70% of the ant species that we have will do that in some form. They will tend aphids or some other hemipteran in some form.
And then you mentioned you're interested in the labor ant.
Yeah, Labor Day ant.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Labor Day ant. Okay. So why? Why specifically that ant?
So my research focus is really on ants in agricultural systems. So for a long time, we've ignored ants in these systems and always thought that they're pests in some way and that kind of thing. I mean, that their aphid tending is not great for us, or at least we've thought in the past. And so I wanted to know what was there, because we still don't really know that. We've just assumed that ants are bad for these agricultural systems. So part of it is what species are in these agricultural systems, and then what are they doing in these agricultural systems. And throughout that investigation, I found that this Labor Day ant was on every agricultural species that we raise in Ontario, and was found in every field that I visited. It was just had a really tight relationship with the plants. And I wanted to break that down further and see like what was going on and why were they so abundant. And I found all kinds of cool stuff. Like in low-lying plants, I've seen them pollinate, so actually take pollen onto their bodies and move it from flower to flower. I've seen them nesting in the root systems, which is helping to aerate the soil. It's helping to move nutrients to the plant's roots. I've seen them feeding on pest species like caterpillars and beetles and even aphids and that kind of thing. So they're doing a variety of really important things that we've traditionally seen them as a species as a pest.
Yeah. Okay. So, when you said they're moving the pollen around,
Yeah.
why are they doing that? Is that an accidental thing, that's connected to something else they're doing and they're accidentally moving the pollen, or is that intentional?
So we don't really know at this point, like whether it's
Ah,
like a bee where it just accumulates and then the
yeah.
bees, it's partially accidental in a lot of bee species as well, but they've got this relationship now that they don't clean themselves of the pollen because they know that it will help propagate the plant into the
Hmm.
future. It might be the same case with ants. I mean, they could easily clean themselves off, but we saw that they didn't. And whether this is an actual representation of pure pollination or just happenstance that they happened to get a bunch of pollen on them while they were trying to feed on, let's say, the nectar of the plant, we don't know yet. We have to classify that still.
So this Labor Day ant, and is this Labor Day ant? It is native. It's always been native to Canada.
Yes.
Is that
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
correct.
Um, so you believe it's playing an integral part in our agriculture.
I think so. And I think a lot of ant species are doing those kind of integral roles. There's so many of them and they're so abundant. They're really a major player in these soil systems. I mean, for instance, we've always thought that earthworms are a really important part of soil
Yes.
systems because they cycle nutrients, they feed on decomposing things, they aerate the soil. But it turns out that ants do the same job as worms, but over 10 times better. They move more soil, they cycle more nutrients. There's just so many of them and they're doing the same kinds of things, but we just haven't focused on them in the same way.
Is this common knowledge now? I mean, what do other farmers or researchers? I don't know. What do they say about this?
No, so it's a really interesting thing, especially in North America. I think there is this bias towards thinking that ants are these pest organisms. And many of the farms that I visited, they actively said that no, we treat our crops so that there are no ants. I mean, it's because they are treated like any other pest species that you wouldn't want on your crops.
Hmm.
But with added knowledge and knowing them better, like we see them in a different light. I think a similar story can be said for pollinators. Like there was a long period of time where most people were scared of them because of their stinging. But
Yes.
as we've learned more about how important these pollinators are and teaching our kids that these are a really important part of our ecosystem and they're feeding us food by pollinating our crops, they've become this better light of an organism. Like we regard them as these cute, beautiful things. And I think that has changed over the history of humans on the planet.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know you have great love and respect for ants to the
I
point
do.
where you actually you actually brought them into your house, didn't you, during the
I do.
pandemic? What
Yeah.
what
So
happened there?
I wasn't able to access my lab over the pandemic because of all the shutdowns and that kind of thing. So I couldn't leave my ants in the lab or else they would all die. And I wanted to continue my experiments. So I brought all over 200 colonies that I had in the lab at the time and started raising them in my basement to the objections of my husband. But it worked out. My experiments got to continue and they all survived, which is nice.
Well, when you say 200 colonies, I mean, roughly how many ants would that be?
Ooh, there was probably well over 200,000 ants in my house at that time.
And what kind of space would they be occupying? Are they like what are they living in? What?
Not very much space, actually, surprisingly.
Oh.
Ants are really good at adapting to the confines that you give them. Most of my colonies are in little containers about this big, not very big at all,
Oh,
like
oh,
a
like a little
centimeter.
jar, or
Yeah, little
oh,
like mason
okay.
jars.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
and so not occupying too much space. It's like a shelf worth of ants. But in those little mason jars, like the ants completely utilize that space. And there's like thousands of them in those little containers.
Oh my god, and none of them escaped, did they?
I had some escapees over the course of the pandemic. I mean, when you're feeding them, it's kind of difficult. Like you open the jar and sometimes they are
Yeah.
unhappy and they just kind of spread out. But nothing too
Nothing
bad.
major. Yeah.
Nothing that my husband noticed. So that's good.
Do you know, I mean, With everything you've been telling me, why haven't ants just completely taken over? Because I have a feeling we are no match for ants.
Yeah, I think part of
Really?
it is that they found niches that they occupy, and that is enough for them. They haven't expanded beyond that because they're surviving, they're propagating, they're growing, they're evolving. And they're not greedy in the way that they want to occupy the entire planet, or like could if they would. Now that's changing with human influence, actually.
Exactly.
We have some invasive species that we've bottlenecked into these small populations, so very genetically related to one another. And then as they've grown in the new environment, then they're so related that they aren't warring with one another. They're not competing with one another for resources. So they've become what we call a super colony. One colony that is functionally like cooperating with each other, and they occupy an entirely huge space. Like, some of these super colonies now span entire continents. The entire continental US has one colony of Argentine ant. It's incredible.
What are the implications of that?
There's huge implications, and we're seeing them actively in the
Yeah.
environment. These ants are highly competitive, so they will extirpate other species, whether that's smaller arthropod species, sometimes in the even like small mammals, but certainly other ants. Like, we've seen that with the presence of invasive ants, the diversity of ants in a given area can be reduced as much as 80%. So huge detrimental impacts.
Wow. Yeah, because it's they're like a monopoly. They've
Yeah.
just monopolized the whole. Okay, not to sound too much like a science fiction movie or novel or something, but no. But what about humans? I mean, should we be worried?
I think that we're big enough and we have enough resources that we would be able to outcompete them. They're
Are
they're
you
not
sure?
quite at
Maybe
our
all that
level.
maybe all it takes is like one little mutation. Who
Oh,
knows?
you never know.
You
Maybe
know what I
maybe
mean?
something happens in the lab and they
Well,
become super smart or something.
well, no, or even, you know what? Or even we make it increasingly tough for them to survive. And then so they go crazy because then their resources are limited. And then they're like, okay, humans,
there's
sorry, we're going
always
to get you next.
there's always the chance.
Well, I have to say, I mean, you've spent now, since you were little, so many years studying ants. What kind of impact have they had on you, like on your life?
I mean, a huge impact. I mean, insects in general have given me appreciation for diversity, and like diversity of forms and the beauty of nature, and like how that things that look so different from us can be so like beautiful and like worthwhile to keep around, even if they scare us in some ways, that there is some value to them just intrinsically from existing on the planet and working so hard. And ants are a really great example of how hard they work to do what they do and to be successful in the world, and like how they've evolved in very specialized ways that we took thousands of years to learn with our intelligence. They did over the course of millions of years and have done for millions of years even better than we have. And I think that's a really beautiful thing. And the fact that if we were paying attention to ants when we were living in the caves, if we were paying attention to them, maybe we would have discovered agriculture all the sooner,
Hmm.
right? There's so much that we can learn from insects on the planet and arthropods in general. Like, they're just super successful and beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm listening to you. I was thinking exactly that. That, I mean, what aspect of life, whether it's socialization, teamwork, even that sometimes you need a hierarchy, agriculture, survive, all those business, they make aqueducts, architecture. We can learn from so many different areas.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that we're trying to do now, like actively learning from the organisms that we see in the environment. Like, a really great example recently is beetle species that have really tough exoskeletons. We've used those as references for new Kevlar materials and that kind of thing. And I think paying attention to ants and their behaviors and how they utilize the environment, we can find new ways to sustainably use the ecosystem around us.
Ooh, fascinating chat. I have a feeling that people listening to this discussion, they will not look at ants the same way anymore.
Good. I hope so
Good luck.
too.
Yeah, good luck with your research, Aaron. All the best with it. And thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Aaron Fairweather is an entomologist and Ph.D. candidate in the Department of Environmental Sciences at the University of Guelph. And if you'd like to know more about Aaron's research, please check out our show notes. That is it for this edition of the Cram Podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. Our thanks to the Temerty Foundation for their generous support. And you might also be interested in our literary podcast. It's called Passage to Wonderland. I highlight compelling passages from books that offer discovery, insight, and a sense of completion for the end of your day. You'll find Passage to Wonderland wherever you get your Cram podcast. Thanks very much for joining us. See you next time.